Why do you think the Pauline epistles were created? What was the purpose of them?
The dramatic setting of the letters, however, assumes a different social situation, the life of the communities of faith. There's a conflict in the letters, just like there's conflict in Acts, but that comes from within the communities. That type of conflict implies, I think, a certain degree of stabilization, conceptually, a stabilization around the message.
What's more plausible? That an Acts narrator sees a literally 5 words in a sentence, or small sentence, and decides, I think I'm just going to write this long story based off this one little sentence, and I am going to anchor it in this earlier mythic motif.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video on the History Bible podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Nina Livesey and also Derek Lambert from MythVision podcast. And again, let's remind everybody that the link to purchase Nina's book, The Letters of Paul in Their Roman Literary Context, Reassessing Apostolic Authorship, will be in the description below in the pinned comment. And with that being said, Nina and Derek, thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you,
Thank
Jacob.
Thanks for the invitation, Jacob.
And so we're going to be continuing the discussion about the later dating of Paul's letters. And to that end, I want to get started with my first question. What was the first of the clues that led you to conclude the epistles of Paul are 2nd century CE texts?
Okay, thank you for that question. Well, there was a backstory. So it wasn't until after I determined that there was nothing really holding the letters to the mid-1st century, and there was a lot of research behind that, and that the letters were likely fictive based on my research, that I began to think about their dating. So I didn't immediately run to the 2nd century, in other words. So as you likely recall, it was my work on the analysis of the letters from a rhetorical perspective that led me to question their authenticity and to the determination that the letters were likely fictive. So bolstering my understanding that the letters are fictive was my observation of a wealth of fictive letters in antiquity. And this is something I learned also as part of the research. And even closer to home, when you think about it, there are many letters in the Hebrew Bible, embedded letters within other texts that are considered fictive. So fictive letters doesn't come out of nowhere, is what I'm trying to say. The 2nd century dating is a result of my first and primary evaluation that the letters are fictive. The 2nd century comes into view when looking for evidence of the letters. And there is where I find that Marcion's collection emerged also in that scholarship for having published the Epistolicon. And his is the first relatively secure evidence of the letters. And he's a 2nd century, mid-2nd century figure. So in earlier scholarship, and I'm thinking here of the Dutch radicals as one example, Marcion also does emerge as a suggested locative location, you might say, as the originating place for the letters, Pauline letters. So another way of saying this, I did come to Marcion, but others have also come to Marcion as well, namely these Dutch radical thinkers. So I hope that answers your question.
Who is Marcion and what did he say about the Pauline epistles?
So Marcion, and thank you for your question, Marcion was active in this mid-2nd century, and his dates, he's actually late 1st century, born around 85, we think, and died around 160. Those are estimated dates. It's thought that he came from Pontus, which is modern-day Turkey, in the city of Sinope, and that he actually came to Rome just after the Bar Kokhba revolt, which dates to 132, 135. So we could say that he showed up in Rome right around 135 or slightly later. He's among the elite class, which plays a role in all of this. He's wealthy, and with his wealth, thought to derive from shipbuilding. So he's from a shipbuilding family, you might say. His social status and his wealth is suggestive, and this is where I think it's important, of someone well positioned to have been afforded the opportunity of a full education, something that required not just money, but time, leisure. It took all of the youth, like it does here, all of your youth till you're 18, let's say, graduating from high school, is devoted to education. But that wasn't the way in the ancient world. Only the wealthy were afforded that type of leisure, and you needed money as well. He also had social connections. So even to have that education meant that he had certain high place social connections. So really, scholars have thought of Marcion as a writer intellectual. Other ancient authors refer to him as a philosopher and a teacher, someone who had a school in Rome. The least problematic, perhaps, of Marcion is that he is thought to have written a work on his own called the Antitheses. That's lost. We don't have it at all. But it was comprised, just as the word antithesis implies, these oppositional statements. And as we have it, in fact, a lot of what we have about Marcion from his opponents actually is that he did have these antitheses, namely between the Jewish law or Torah and the gospel. And he also had a two-God philosophy where there's a creator God, kind of dividing up God, you might say, creator God of Hebrew scriptures, and then a superior God of Jesus Christ, a different God. He's also credited with the term New Testament, and there you have another type of opposition to Old Testament. Today I use the term Hebrew Bible and New Testament, not Old Testament, New Testament. But also well known of Marcion is that he published a 2-volume work that is referred to actually as the New Testament, in which there is a gospel text, in first place, the Evangelion, and 10 letters of Paul. So here's where you get the first instance of Pauline epistles. And that was given a name as well, a book given a name, Apostolikon. As I said, the significance, Evangelion and Apostolikon, I think, are significant. Those works too are lost, unfortunately, and both the Evangelion of Marcion and the Apostolikon, these 10 letters of Paul, have to be recreated from ancient sources, and the main sources there are Tertullian and Epiphanius. They're later, 3rd and 4th century writers who wrote extensively about Marcion and seemingly quoted from those works. So that's how scholars are able to piece it together. But it's not exact. It's taking some creativity as well. Also, I'd like to say it looks like Marcion had Jewish associations, and even someone like Marcus Vincent wrote an article that he was a proselyte Jew. I think that's important. And an issue that merits even more investigation. It makes sense of the references that we see, especially in the Apostolikon, to Jewish scriptures and Jewish allusions to Abraham. Marcion was clearly versed in Hebrew scriptures. So you have to ask, well, how did that happen? In a way, Hebrew scriptures, you might say, is maybe like the Homer of a Roman writer. So I do think there was some Jewish association there. Marcion is also thought to have been concerned about the status of the Jewish God and also Hebrew scriptures. The Epistolicon deals with the ongoing relevance of Jewish practices like circumcision for Gentiles specifically. And at the time of that 2-volume work, the Evangelion Apostolikon, there is no longer a Jewish kingdom, a Jewish state. Jerusalem is no longer. And Marcion is writing in Rome. So I think all of that plays a role in how we understand Marcion and how we understand the Evangelion and how we understand the Apostolikon, or the letters of Paul, the context, who he is and when he's writing and where he's writing. What does Marcion say about Pauline letters? I have little to report on this. We have indirect information. According to Tertullian, Marcion claimed, and this is not so much about Paul, but that he found the letter of Galatians. That's according to Tertullian. But what's interesting to me about that is this is precisely the kind of statement you would expect to see of a writer or an editor who's writing in the name of someone else. It's a cover, you might say. To say that you find a letter preserves a cover of authenticity, which is exactly what I think is at play here with the Pauline letters. They look like they're authentic. They're made to look authentic. So, and I also know that Marcion was highly criticized for focusing on only one apostle, Paul. So if you think about that, and you only had one gospel and the letters of Paul, you wouldn't know that there's any other letters. And indeed, there may not have actually been any other letters at the time of that publication, Marcion's publication.
You mean to tell me the golden plates that Joseph Smith found, he didn't write them? Sorry.
So
I hope that answers.
Yeah, I certainly thought it did. Both and your previous answers, but that is interesting, isn't it? The Tertullian saying that Marcion found Galatians.
Yeah,
that is interesting. Did the canonical Pauline epistles come before or after Marcion's edition?
Thank you. This is an important question, and I know it's being debated now. I have adopted the view that the canonical epistles succeed or come later than the Marcionite collection, and that the authors of the canonical letters add information and even add additional letters. And maybe I can back this up a little bit. Do issues raised in the sources shed light on this question? The Marcion and canonical versions differ with regard to the character Timothy. In Acts, and I'm going to move to Acts here just momentarily, Paul is seen to circumcise Timothy, accommodating to Jews. Yet Titus, mentioned in Galatians, is not circumcised. In Acts, Timothy is a Jew-Gentile figure, like a liminal character, who accompanies Paul. The canonical Pauline letters then pick up on Timothy, as Paul's co-worker. He is also a co-sender of several canonical Pauline letters. Yet the Marcionite letters, at least from the recreations that we have, make no mention of Timothy. So there's a little difference there with the character Timothy. It looks like the canonical letters are being changed to be closer to Acts, whereas the Marcionite set of letters has an Apostle Paul who remains squarely and more firmly in disagreement with the Paul of Acts. Otherwise put, the Marcionite Apostle Paul has no need or interest in this liminal or transitional character, Timothy. It doesn't mention Timothy, it mentions Titus, right? For another, Marcion's letter to the Romans is shorter. It ends at at the end of chapter 14. It lacks the two final chapters that are in the canonical version. 15 and 16 are in canonical, but not the Marcionite version of Romans. I would say then that those two chapters are added, although modern and ancient sources, even Origen, claim that Marcion excised or deleted those last two chapters of Romans. Of course, that was kind of the party line already from all these polemicists, that Marcion was deleting material. It looks like Origen is just repeating the party line, you might say. We know, however, that other New Testament writings had additional endings added. And I'm thinking here of the Gospels of Mark and the Gospel of John, and that's been known in scholarship for a long time. So it was a common place to add. The reason given for those additions, and there's even been scholarship on why adding, a rationale given, it's to harmonize with other New Testament writings. And I think you could use that same rationale with a longer ending of Romans, that it's harmonizing, trying to bring everything together in a canon that is all supposed to look similar and work together. Characters are working together. So that's one way that I would say that the Marcionite version is shorter and it was earlier. So I came across, and this may be applicable as well, this reference in Irenaeus, and I was looking at it just recently, and it may respond to this question as well. And it's a passage I cite in the book. In the passage, Irenaeus is criticizing the centrality of Paul for Marcion. Remember, I said Marcion's criticized because he only wants to deal with one apostle, Paul, or one character, really, Paul, with the letters. And so I'll just read a couple of lines here. Let Paul himself refute those who assert that he alone had knowledge of the truth, Paul, inasmuch as the mystery was manifested to him by revelation. For he said, Paul said, that one and the same God who worked through Peter for the mission to the circumcised worked also through himself for the Gentiles. And there Irenaeus is quoting from Canonical Galatians 2, 7-8. But what's interesting is when you look at the Marcionite recreated version of Galatians, that line about Peter is not there at all. So what is going on here? It looks like Irenaeus is making an argument against Marcion, but by means of a reference in a different version of Galatians. So it's kind of a dirty deal, you might say here. In other words, he's not playing fairly. So did someone else add to Galatians to assist Irenaeus in order to make that kind of a remark against Marcion. One could perhaps think that. So in other words, another possible way of saying that Marcion's work was earlier. Marcion's versions of the letters are earlier. And I'll also say that I worked on the opening formula or the opening address of the Pauline letters. I do quite a bit of that in the book. And so by comparison, however, to the Marcionite opening formulas, the canonical letter openings are more structured and formulaic. For canonical Romans, the opening is 7 verses long, and that is not in the Marcionite version at all. So it looks to me as though the individual's letters grew also stylistically and in conformity with one another, as another argument to say the canonical letters had more attention placed on them, and that to me makes it seem as though they're later. I hope that answers your question.
How do the Pauline epistles parallel Greco-Roman epistolary writings?
So in my book, I argue that the canonical Pauline letters do not conform well with common or everyday Greco-Roman correspondence, and I'm not going to go through that now. The everyday letters are thought to be occasional, ephemeral, here today, gone tomorrow. Pauline scholars, however, did compare Pauline letters to that type of Greco-Roman letter, and with little all-around success. But what I want to get across with the book is that Pauline letters have a comfortable home in what's known as pseudonymous letter collections. And it's that genre of letter that has even been characterized as very well known and very frequently used. But it's something that we're not taught. Graduate students aren't taught pseudonymous letter collections. It's rarely even considered. It's not considered, I would say, with regard to Pauline letters. So the first and necessary observation is that for them to fit with this category, pseudonymous letter collections, is that Pauline letters come to us as a collection. So, of course, the authentic perspective pushes against that notion because they're real letters. The authentic perspective doesn't think of Pauline letters as a collection. So the first thing one has to do is realize that the first evidence is as a collection, and then one is able to make these moves that I've made here with the pseudonymous letter collection parallel. So as a type of conceptual parallel, we have something similar to that collection of Pauline letters in Revelation, the book of Revelation, where we actually see a collection, but they're embedded letters. There's another parallel with those letters too, in that their addressees go to prominent cities. So there is some precedent, you might say, for the notion of a collection and even the notion of sending letters out widely. Those letters of Revelation were thought to go to the whole world when thought of symbolically. Pseudonymous letter collections, in contrast to Revelation, are standalone letters, and they're attributed to a well-known figure. And the collection gives that featured figure, in this case, the Apostle Paul, right, a solo voice, and they extend what is already known of that character. And Jacob, this is for you. And while they are literary fakes, according to modern epistolary theorists, They're not intended to maliciously deceive. Indeed, just the reverse. They're written to be plausible writings of the character. So, this often employed term forgery is to me not a good descriptor, as it implies intent to deceive. And we have these scholars, Hindi Naiman and Irene Periano Garrison, who define pseudonymity, of which this is playing a role, as interpretive gesture, and where the author is less important. Remember, I said earlier that Marcion said he found Galatians? He wanted it to be Pauline, but he had no qualms about a letter being in Paul's name. That was the whole goal of it. It should be in Paul's name. So I say it's a nice fit because that Pauline letters are a nice fit to these pseudonymous letter collections, because we've got this character Paul, and he is made famous in the book of Acts. He dramatically changes from a persecutor of Christ's communities, to one of the strongest voices for the faith. And the last half of Acts, he's clearly the main figure, the protagonist. You might call him the hero of Acts. The letters, however, show a much more reasoned and reflective figure, and that's what these letters do. And the Apostle Paul engages in theological reasoning and teaching and moral exhortation. So you see a different character in the letters. And with letters, I also found a nice fit. You don't have to say all the Pauline letters. Here you can think of 13 letters. They don't have to all be said to have been by the same author. And here I'm talking about the actual author. And in fact, you often see many different authors with these kinds of letters. I don't want to make such a strong necessary fit, but it's a good conceptual way to shift the narrative, to think of them in another way. And there is a genre that is extant. It's existing. There are lots of pseudonymous letter collections. So it's not completely out of the realm of possibility. In fact, it looks possible and probable to me. So I hope that answers that.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you so much. The standard model is that Acts, or at least not even the standard, Bart Ehrman denies this. I've interviewed him on this, that Acts is using Paul's letters. But I would go with the mastermind himself, Pervo, and his commentary, and others who've documented this with MacDonald and others. That they see there's too much going on between Acts and the letters, and that Acts is using Paul's letters. So my question is, what are, if we're using this model that Acts comes first, for those who don't know, that's your position, what are details, and this is a fun thought experiment,
Right.
in Pauline letters that show that they are derivative of Acts?
Yeah, this is a great question, and you're pushing me on this, which it's good to be pushed. Although I'm not encouraging you guys to push me too much. But so I've come up with a few comments for you. The first is, which I've already mentioned, the letters are ascribed to the Apostle Paul, and Paul is made known in Acts. So I could say that is number one. You need Acts before you can have the letters ascribed to that character. And there I'm following epistolary scholarship. But here's some more points I could contribute here. Acts deals with the lives of 12 apostles. Its Greek title is Praxis Apostolon. In actuality, it's really dealing with just a few apostles. Peter, who is legitimately an apostle, the main apostle in Acts. Paul's illegitimate, he's hardly an apostle. But it's largely about Peter. You see some with Philip and other characters, but not all 12 for sure. But for their part, the letters regard one apostle, barely identified as an apostle in Acts. In New Testament writings, the term apostle, well, given first a mention in the gospel texts, it receives much more attention, as you can imagine, in Acts, whose very title uses the word apostles. And if you do a search, you see the word apostles all over Acts. I mean, that's the main hit on that word for a search, okay? But to credit Pauline letters with the first written use of the term in the sense of apostle of Jesus Christ, to me seems unlikely. This is because the letters insist upon the title apostle for Paul. And so, just conceptually and logically, why would one insist on Paul being an apostle and an apostle of Jesus Christ if that notion is not already known from elsewhere? So that's something else that occurs to me with a precedent of the term apostles, which shows up in Acts. The dramatic period for both Acts and the letters of Paul is post-resurrection, right? They're both dealing with a post-resurrection world, right? And both of them then are talking about what comes next. So that's kind of the lay of the land for both of them. And there's steady state, you might say, even playing field. The dramatic setting and chronology of Acts, however, is different from that of the letters of Paul, and it appears primary or earlier, conceptually. So Acts describes the very beginning period, post-resurrection period, when there is opposition to the message from outsiders, largely from Jews. It tells how the message of Christ goes first to the Jews, then to the Gentiles amidst this resistance. Paul's speeches in Acts are explanatory of the basics of the message, and he 3 times, comes in the speeches as well, rehearses his conversion to the faith. So you see kind of basic information there. To me, this seems rudimentary about the faith. Acts itself in scholarship is characterized as a legitimating narrative. That's neither here nor there. I guess you could, it doesn't necessarily play into the chronology, but it plays into the basics of the story of Acts. The dramatic setting of the letters, however, assumes a different social situation, the life of the communities of faith. There's a conflict in the letters, just like there's conflict in Acts, but that comes from within the communities. That type of conflict implies, I think, a certain degree of conceptually, a stabilization around the message, enough time for disputes and questions to arise, for instance. So the dramatic setting of the letters seems to me logically later than the events surrounding the character Paul in Acts. And I have a few more things I can add to this. 1 Thessalonians 2:14-15 look very much like it provides evidence of knowledge of Acts. Those are only loose, those full verses are not necessarily in the Marcionite version of Thessalonians, but there is reference to persecution. Those verses speak of Jewish persecution of Christ groups, which is very much a theme in Acts. Okay, I don't see where you'd find that other than in Acts. Galatians 1:13-14 is a brief reference to Paul's, or rather Saul's, persecution of Christ groups. And it, to me, seems to assume knowledge of a larger scenario as narrated 3 times in Acts. The canonical version of Galatians makes that assumption of Acts, the assumption of back knowledge of Acts, more explicit, as it overtly has the phrase, "You have heard, no doubt, of my earlier life in Judaism." So, okay, to have heard that, that is huge in Acts, okay? So, is that a shout out? Then you also have Galatians 1:17. The apostle knows of other apostles. Apostle Paul knows of other apostles in Jerusalem. That again is something, a theme in Act. You know that there's a church in Jerusalem and other apostles are there. There's figures within Pauline letters, Peter, James, or Jacob, and John, known also in Acts. So one can ask the same question: how would the apostle Paul of the letters in the 50s, which is in the historical perspective on the letters, how would he have known those characters were it not for Acts or a gospel? The travel itinerary, this is my last comment here, the travel itinerary of the Paul in Acts matches the addressees named within Pauline letters. So, which is the earliest reference? So, using the example of Corinth, one can see that Acts 18, we see a typical Acts motif in which Paul goes first to the synagogue, and the Jews oppose him, and then he goes to the Gentiles. And there he's going to a house, and he stays in this house for a year and a half teaching the word of God, but you don't get any information about what he's teaching. You don't get the content. You don't get anything. So we know, however, that there is a cell in Corinth, a Christ community in Corinth. And I think that's important as it set up. It's a good setup for the letters. The apostle has a relationship then to this Corinth. And there again, to me, it looks like Acts sets up a backstory that can then be redeployed by letters to the Corinthians, which are much more detailed about what's going on there in those communities from the point of view of Paul. So there's a few things.
Jacob, you mind if I make one comment about this fascinating observation real quick, and then
go ahead.
Let you take the wheel and drive the car the rest of the way? So I was pulling on some of these threads. You gave me the idea, and I was like, okay, hold on. What if we play this game? Let's flip it around and see if it looks like it might make better sense. And I came across some writings for Mark Bilby wrote an article with Anna Leftero, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, where he shows, I think definitively, building on prior scholarship, of course, but they went a little further, that the narrative of Paul, specifically that he gets at the Areopagus, is actually modeled off of Orestes and Iphigenia. And they're both on trial in Athens. The interesting part is there ends up being this almost riot where they're trying to capture them and, of course, kill them in the Acts narrative. And this is echoed in that earlier 500 year earlier, 500 to 600 year earlier play by Aeschylus and, of course, Euripides. And like details, like it becomes shocking how similar some of the motifs are, right? And I think that this might be a literary antecedent, right? So your idea came to my mind, and I said, hold on. If I can anchor that Acts is dependent on earlier mythic material, whether it be Jewish scripture, Greek play and tragedy, or Homeric epic, you name it, Virgil, any of this stuff as a template, which would then put it away from historicity, clearly. And then I can look at the letters, and I see commonality or continuity in some way, shape, or form. What's more plausible? That an Acts narrator sees a literally 5 words in a sentence, or small sentence, and decides, I think I'm just going to write this long story based off this one little sentence, and I am going to anchor it in this earlier mythic motif, or that they wrote a powerful story that is echoed, like you said, with nods from this later epistolary fiction we call Paul's letters, almost like they know. And I found an interesting one. There's many, but I won't go into all of them here. I'll do a video on this. Is I wrestled with beast at Ephesus. And scholars have scratched their head and said, hold on, he just drops this bomb and moves on? Like, who's these people? What happened? Well, you can go to Acts and you can read the story of the beast he wrestles in Ephesus. So it's not a definitive thing, but it's a great thought experiment. What if these are secondary? And if they are, can we take this outside of Acts and then apply this to the Gospels? And once we do that, we're in big trouble, because the rest of the world is like, they're all believing this chronology. Paul in the 50s, then you have the Gospels building off of that, and then they grant, okay, these other Pauline epistles that are fake know the Gospels and Acts. So they give like fake letters of Paul somewhat, but they can't shift their dominoes to make it fit, it seems. I don't know.
Yeah, Acts is extremely interesting, how it's put together and all the allusions it's making. It's really fascinating, and I think it's very important to telling the story, right, of early Christianity. I mean, you have to think, where would you be without Acts? That so much of the conceptuality of early Christianity comes from Acts. Right, and I do think it's mythic. The whole thing is mythic. But it's very important for the tradition, extremely important. And as I said, I think it's how we get the Apostle Paul. So that's the big shift that I make. That's how we get Paul.
It may solve the silence in Paul. We've always asked about, why is he not talking about Jesus' life? Why is he not narrating this? He doesn't need to. And so I personally think I get why positions like Richard Carrier come up and are trying to make sense of this absence of awareness of narrations and quotes of the Lord. It isn't necessary. The goal, and you already know this stuff. Why do I need to repeat what's already in these other texts when they may have been companions, especially if Marcion's Evangelion is complementary with the letters? And so they already know what they're reading here. Just a thought experiment. So
right.
Sorry for jumping in again, Jacob.
No, interesting.
No problem at all. But this does raise a question, and that is, based on what you said earlier about the use of Acts, or the parallels to Acts, is much more clear in the canonical edition than in the Marcionite edition. Do you think that Acts is situated between the Marcionite edition and the canonical edition?
I think it could be. I think that there is a lot of going back and forth there, and that Acts itself was being changed too. I mean, that could also be happening. As I said, this harmonization, when you get to the actual canonicity or canonical versions, things are moving around. So I do see where Acts played a role in the canonical versions, but I also see where the letters are pulling from Acts. Marcionite letters are pulling from Acts. That's, I guess, another reason why I think this Acts is very central. And it would make sense if you're trying to tell a cohesive story. You don't want to come up with brand new characters. You want to use a character that's already known, famous character. For instance, we have letters of Peter, right? A known character. So there was something about writing in the name of Paul, because he's already there. He's an important person. So I don't know if that has answered your question. a roundabout way, perhaps, Jacob.
I thought you did. Do the Pauline texts provide internal clues that they were written much later in time than generally believed?
Thank you. So if we consider that the letters follow on Acts, and Acts is a 2nd century text, then yes, the letters themselves are later. As mentioned in the letters, Paul's an apostle, and this concept must have been developed before it could be used and have any kind of resonance in the letters. So there is something else, that notion of apostle. The letters also know of Christ resurrected, and they even know that a resurrection happened after 3 days. Okay. That information is known in a gospel text. Now, what I'm saying is perhaps controversial to historical perspective. But if we're thinking this is literature, okay, then that 3 days is there already in a gospel text. And it's given a life there, right? A story, what happens in those 3 days. The letters pick up on it. Repeating some of what I said, Paul's knowledge of figures, such as Peter, James, and John, those are mentioned in the Marcionite material, Marcionite letters of Paul. They also derive, so I think that's anachronistic as well, from either a gospel or Acts. And in the book, I don't mention a lot of that stuff in the book that I just mentioned to you here. In the book, I talk about another issue, and I try to place it socially in a 2nd century context, and that's the issue of circumcision. That's chapter 4. I go into that in considerable detail. So in the letters, there's arguments, and perhaps the canonical, I'll grant this, have more sophisticated arguments against circumcision than the Marcionites, but certainly they're there in the Marcionites. That issue of the non-necessity of circumcision is there in the Marcionites. That issue doesn't appear, I argue, in the book until these arguments against circumcision don't appear until the 2nd century. And we see that in things like Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho and the Epistle of Barnabas. So that the way circumcision is being discussed, to me, is a signal of a 2nd century situation. It reflects a socio-political situation around the events of Bar Kokhba. And we also know that there was Roman legislation at that time, which may have even precipitated the war against what they call genital mutilation, but it was thought to also apply to circumcision. All of these issues are hot topics, you might say, at that time. And then going back to what I said earlier about Marcion, Marcion is writing from Rome under Roman rule, and there is no more Judea. That's gone. So circumcision is already problematic, you might say. The Jewishness of it has become problematic, especially among Romans, right? So that's another way in which I say that those letters fit nicely in a 2nd century context.
If I may, Jacob, you brought this to my attention, just a cool comment in the thought process that we've been thinking in here, Nina. Jacob was one of the ones who really made me, I knew about this in the past, but he nails me on this all the time. He'll hammer it, right? And when you hear it repeated, it makes you think. And that is 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 16, right? We always emphasize this point in this verse that says, the wrath of God has come upon them at last, right? Who's it talking about? The Jews. What's odd, in my opinion, is really that's like the icing on the cake of, I think, nodding to recognition of the temple, and or at least even Bar Kokhba, you could say. I mean, it could be the combination of both, but is in their effort to keep us from speaking to the Gentiles so that they may be saved. The Acts narrative is all about this. In this way, and it's not just in Acts, you kind of get this at least hinted at maybe in the Gospel of John, even though like Matthew's mission's mainly toward the Jews, there is a lot of Gentile kind of nods throughout these Gospels, but Acts really narrates it, right? So speaking to the Gentiles so that they may be saved, in this way, they always heap up their sins to the limit. The wrath of God has come upon them at last. I think this is a nod at how Acts narrates this, but Jacob made this point, and I thought, man, so we have two models that usually work in their minds. Well, they added this verse, this little insertion.
Mm-hmm.
But the rest of it, we can anchor that. And I thought to myself, sure, interpolations happen. And yeah, but what's probably happening here is, why not the easier, smoother, seemingly less ad hoc position? Exactly. And that is just, they're written later.
It's there. Yeah, it's already there.
There's
and that sounds so much like Justin Martyr. You deserve what's coming to you. That's Justin Martyr talking to Jews. Yeah. What happened? You deserve this. It's really strong. This suffering that you have. Yeah.
There's a verse in 1 Corinthians I've also pointed out for several years that in which it is being said, let's not worship God in buildings that are subject to the flames. That is some very strange talk for somebody supposedly writing before 70 AD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's weird. Mm-hmm.
That's why I definitely, I'm of the mindset that the letters are after 70 AD. It makes more sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great.
Are Paul and his opponents in the epistles all fictional characters?
Well, I do see the letters as fictive, and the situations posited there also as fictive. But his opponents is an interesting one. I also see the opponents as fictive, as they're narrated there, and especially in Galatians, let's say. But it could point to actual opposition that's on the ground there. For instance, Marcion and the author of Acts, or Marcion and the Gospel of Luke, where there's differences of opinion. So there could have been actual opposition, and we know there's opposition. I mean, there's 4 different Gospels all taking a different take. So the opposition could be relying on something that is on the ground, but in terms of, is it actual within the letters? I don't think so. I think it's for rhetorical effect, that opposition.
Why do you think the Pauline epistles were created? What was the purpose of them?
So the letters permit the development of doctrine or teachings and moral exhortation from an authoritative figure of the faith, rendered seemingly in his own voice. So one sentence. Okay, and that is how we really understand the letters. It's funny, but I don't know that with that I'm saying anything extraordinary, other than to say, as you know, that I don't think they're real letters, but that it is to promote doctrine and teachings. And that's what they've done, right? They have been the source of the teachings. So I see a parallel reason even for other New Testament letters, for Peter and John and James and Jude or Judas. And we come to it secondarily. We're reading over the shoulder these letters. And to do that is interesting. because it's seductive to read over the shoulder information that's not to you, but it's for somebody else. Like you're thinking, I'm finding out what Paul really said to these Corinthians. There's something interesting about that, right? It brings the reader in. And as one person, and he may have been hearing one of my earlier podcasts with you, Jacob, wrote to me afterwards with a whole write-up of how letters function. And he put it this way: a letter invites the reader into a vicarious experience, drawing her or him into a relationship that's already in progress. I thought that was kind of interesting. And it answers the question, why use a letter? Why make a letter? Why not just have the treatises of the Apostle Paul, right? So with the Pauline letters, and this is what I pick up in the book, my final point here, the addressees are communities of faith established in prominent ancient cities and regions. And this gives either a further impression of the success of the mission. Acts does that as well and says how many believers after, Peter made a speech and, thousands of people believed. You see that motif happening in Acts, but with letters going to prominent regions and many prominent regions, you also get that concept of the success of the mission and how widespread it is. So a letter allows that too, because it's seemingly going out, right? So finally, if this seems like a stretch, I will add that fictive letters were very common and highly popular in antiquity. This is something I learned, and it's not discussed at all in this scholarship on Pauline letters. So that's what I have.
And I'd like to remind everybody that the link to purchase Nina's book, The Letters of Paul in a Roman Literary Context, will be in the description below in the pinned comment. I'll also have Derek's YouTube channel tagged in the description below and also the link in the pinned comment. So if you haven't subscribed to his channel, you can click on even those links and subscribe to his channel already. And that being said, Nina and Derek, thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. It was fun.
Thank you, Nina.
Thank you. Yep. Great to see you, Derek and Jacob.
You as well.
Yep. Yeah, thank you. And this was fun. Yep. All right, everybody. I'll see y'all later.